All right, people are still joining, but let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nicholas Lepolis. I'm a PhD candidate in politics at the University of Oxford. And I'm very happy to welcome you to the last event in our current OUCAN seminar series. For this event, I'm very happy to welcome a great panel of specialists to discuss the issue of race in China. As many of you know, as everyone will know, 2020 was a very momentous year. Besides the COVID pandemic, one of the most significant events was the massive mobilization for racial equality that accompanied George Floyd's death in the US. This movement, this mobilization, its significance went beyond the borders of the United States, and it was influenced movements in countries as diverse as France, Japan, Sudan, Brazil, all mobilizing to demand the end of discriminatory practices based on race. This was also these movements also reached China for different reasons, perhaps mainly due to the allegations of mistreatment of Africans who lived in China, especially in the southern city of Guangzhou. This received worldwide attention, and China and Chinese authorities, the population and the authorities, faced significant criticism, not least in Africa. More recently this year, a few weeks ago, we saw a repeat of this discussion on racial discrimination in China as an episode, as we all witnessed an episode when the televised celebration of the Lunar New Year showed a Chinese actress in blackface in an act considered deeply offensive in most of the world. It was a repetition of an episode that already happened in 2018, and that led to a lot of outrage across Africa and across the world. While these episodes have received a lot of criticism, a lot of people from China have also avoided the view that to decry them as instances of racism is essentially misattributing Western categories onto a very different cultural landscape. So in view of all of this, this begs the question of trying to get a more detailed and nuanced understanding of the forms in which racialization works in contemporary China, and how these processes may be changing on the light of growing nationalism on the one hand, but also anti-racist mobilization in China and worldwide on the other. In addition, for its inherent importance for the livelihoods of immigrant or expatriate community, whatever term we choose to adopt, foreigners living in China, the racial question in the Chinese context is also bound to have repercussions felt worldwide due to China's consolidation as a global superpower. We all know that race is a social construction, but is one that is deeply enmeshed in the fabric of modernity. And it doesn't seem to be disappearing anytime soon, contrary to earlier beliefs. So given the context of China's rise and the increasing movement of people across the globe, it is important to understand how important actors such as China are dealing with this issue, and how to see the evolution of this issue. And in order to shed light on these questions, I'm very happy to introduce a great panel, including some of the world's most renowned specialists of race and racialization in China. We have Professor Adams Bodomo, who's Professor of African Linguistics and Literature at the University of Vienna, and also founding director of the Global African Diaspora Studies. He's also president of the Fédération Internationale des Langues et Littératures Modernes, and one of the greatest authority in the studies of African diasporas in China. His research interests also include African linguistics, African diasporas, and the documentation of African languages and literatures. Also joining us is Professor Roberto Castillo, who is assistant professor in the Department of Cultural Studies at Lingnan University. He has over 10 years of experience working with African communities in China, and has published academically on the topic in multiple platforms and participated in various conferences, workshops, and radio and TV shows. And in addition, he runs a prominent website on Africans in China, africansinchina.net. We also have Professor Shanshan, who is associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Amsterdam. She has held positions in various universities, including Northwestern University, Connecticut College, and Hong Kong Baptist University. And she has conducted various research projects on various themes linked to migration, diasporas, and racial formation. Her current project, funded by the European Research Council, examines how Western notions of the Western notion of whiteness is disassembled and reassembled in the new historical context of China's rise as a global superpower. So just to give you some practical details, we'll have each of the panelists present for 10 minutes. After that, I'll open the floor for Q&A. In order to participate in the Q&A, you can either click the raise hand button and I'll pass on the camera to you so you can speak, or you can write your question on the Q&A tab at the bottom, and I'll communicate the question to the panelists. So please, without further ado, I'll be happy to, let's hear from Professor Bodomo, who will be talking about the recent scandal of blackface, and I'll share his presentation, which, let me just close this. Professor Bodomo, wait a second, which is here. Can you see it? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Great. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Nicholas Lipolis. It's a very timely thing that you and your colleagues at Oxford University have done in setting up this panel. It's a very timely panel. So I'm very happy to be invited to it. I'm also happy to be on the same panel as two of the most important colleagues who have worked on the African diaspora in China, Roberto and Shanshan. So I'm very happy to be on this panel with you. And I also thank the audience for availing yourself to listen to us. My topic is on blackface and other acts of perceived anti-Black racism in China. Can you go on? Yeah. So I want to use this as a lead-in. Now, we live in a world in which virtually no part of the is shielded from racism, from xenophobia, and other acts of discrimination. We're not spared from acts of racism directed at it, even though Black, brown, and yellow skins often get the brunt of the whole thing. China cannot also be an exception to this global phenomenon called racism. It is therefore inaccurate and even wrong and probably even disingenuous for any scholar or politician to say that there's no racism in China. In this short expose, I will use the frequently occurring incidences of blackface performances in China as an entry point to make a few remarks about the problem of the perception of anti-Black racism and how to address this to pave the way for continuous development of Africa-China relations. I believe very much in win-win relations between Africa and China, and I think that racism can be an impediment to this win-win relationship. Yeah. So what is blackface? It's a kind of art which often involves, using costumes by non-Black people to portray themselves as Blacks. And a good example is this 1900 cartoon, which you can see on the screen. Blackface was very popular in the US in the 20th and in the 19th and 20th centuries. But in this century, it's become very unpopular. In fact, it is viewed as negative and it is offensive to Black people. And so it is something that it's almost discarded and discredited in the US. So it shouldn't actually be used anywhere else in any part of the world. But there is still blackface performances going on in China. And actually people talk about 218 and 221, but actually way back in 206, there was this blackface performance at one of the earliest Forum for Africa-China Cooperation summits in Beijing. And there was a blackface performance, I think at the opening and at the closing ceremony. And of course it happened again in 218 and in 221. And usually during Chinese New Year celebrations, as Nicholas mentioned in his introductory speech. Here's an example of blackface on the screen. Actually, if you can see the other side, is the smaller figure is having the blackface on him. And that was the Lunar New Year celebration one. Now, as a Wikipedia article talks about, it documents on that on February 15, 2018, a comedy sketch titled Same Joy, Same Happiness, which was intended to celebrate Chinese-Africa ties on that year's New Year Gala. It drew an audience of 800 million people, usually a very large audience, in which Chinese actresses were in blackface, makeup, with a giant fake bottom, mimicking an African mother, while a performer only exposing black arms, the monkey accompanying her, and all this. And at the end of the skit, the actress says, "China, I love Chinese people, I love China." So this was one of the acts in 2018. But of course, it's also happened still in 2021. So after being broadcast, the scene was widely criticized as awkward and as completely racist on Twitter, on Weibo, and so on and so forth. You know, and you know, people really criticize it by people, I mean, all over around the world. But the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, said that it was China is opposed to any form of racism. But he also mentioned that he wants to mention that there are any people who want to seize on this to exaggerate matters and sow discord in China's relations with Africa is doomed to failure. That's what he said at the time. I will address this later on. Now, in 2021, the same thing happened. So they didn't learn anything from the 2018 one. It still happened again, and this time again with people wearing African clothing and other approximations. So, and a Weibo user, the Weibo users again were very angry at this, and some of them, one of them asked the following: is there any difference between Chinese people doing blackface and white people slanting their eyes to make fun of Asians, you know, as a Weibo media user? So this was a very telling message. So there are some people in China who are actually seeing this as racist and are fighting against it. Can we go on, Nicola? Yeah. So a number of questions can be asked, you know, about it. And I actually thank the journalists who asked me these questions. Why does this keep happening, even though people are angry about it? Is it out of ignorance, or they need to be politically correct? Or is it even done in good faith as a way to celebrate, but not to mock people of color? So these are questions we can ask, and in addition to what you also asked in your introductory, introduction to this panel. So in this panel, I want to address some of these questions towards the restoration of the dignity of African people in China and the promotion of good relations between Africans and their hosts. Several academic studies and newspaper reports have frequently reported on the incidences of anti-Black racism and racism in general in China. And there are several of them on this slide, but we can go on. But this kind of racist act is that is the blackface phenomenon, and incidences and perceptions of it keeps happening because, in my opinion, China needs race education. China also needs race legislation. Throughout my more than 20 years of looking at Africa-China relations, I've often proposed in my work that China must revise its educational system to educate its populace about other races. China must also legislate against acts of racism. So many racist acts go unpunished in China until the Chinese government starts acknowledging that there is racism in China and punishing people who commit acts of racism. The issue of racism against Blacks in China will not abate. Can we go on there? So, and I have two examples which I don't have time to explain, but everybody knows about the McDonald's incident in Guangzhou during the COVID times, when Africans, there was just this big notice in the restaurant or in front of the restaurant saying that Black people should not be served. That was a clear example of racism. You know, I also have an experience in which I was asked to give a lecture in a Guangzhou University, and in a large audience, about 1,000 students. At the end of my lecture, a student got up to ask a question and said, am I ashamed of my skin color? You know, things like that. So, it's these kind of things. So please go on. I could talk more about this later on.